Hello, I am Dr. Amanda Allen, Assistant Professor in the History Department. Today we are celebrating Constitution Day. In 1787, on September 17th, the Founding Fathers signed what became the United States Constitution. In 2004, Senator Robert Byrd submitted an amendment to have Constitution Day marked as an official holiday. Under the law, all schools who receive any sort of federal aid are required to provide educational programs to help Americans better understand the foundation of the American nation and law system. So that's what we're going to be doing today at Brewton-Parker. I'm honored to be speaking today along with Professor Ferris Sen, Assistant Professor of English, and Dr. Roger Byrd, Adjunct Professor of Political Science and Criminal Justice. My discussion is titled Something Borrowed, Something New, English Tradition in the Constitution. I will be speaking on the historical context shaping the ideas found in the U.S. Constitution. Professor Sen's talk is titled The Writing of the Constitution, Revelations from Draft Comparisons, and details the process of writing and revising the Constitution. And lastly, Dr. Byrd's discussion, titled Amending the Constitution, a Deliberately Difficult Process, which is also difficult to say, will discuss the procedures of amending as laid out in Article 5. And I'm just going to go first, and we'll move down and see what we all have to say. The United States Constitution owes much to its historical background. The ideas which it promoted were not new, but were part of several political revolutions dating back to 1215. I will discuss the similarities our Constitution holds with the 1215 Magna Carta, the 1688 English Bill of Rights, and the ideas promoted during the Enlightenment, which is when the Founding Fathers were writing. In combining the various aspects of these historical contexts, the new American nation did in fact create a new, unique document, even though it was not entirely of new ideas. But the blending of these old ideas created a new America, a blending perhaps marking the start to our unique melting pot society. In 1215, King John I of England faced an uprising from his leading nobles. As the nobles continued to face victory, their demands grew. June 15, 1215, on Runnymede battlefield after a successful victory, the nobles presented a list for John's acceptance and signature. This list established that the English nobility had certain rights not even the king could overstep. Due to continued defeats, John had to sign it, and so it was official July 15, 1215. It became the central foundation of English and later British common law. Although at first the rights were for nobles alone, the ideas held in the Magna Carta would gradually extend to larger portions of the populace and even to the British colonists. Such important issues as trial by peers, due process under the law, and assurance the king could not come and strip nobles of property or wealth without due cause. These were not new ideas in themselves, but based on medieval noble privilege. However, it was the way these were being addressed here in 1215 that was new. The king was not bestowing these rights on his nobles, but the nobles, the people, were demanding these rights from the king. With John's signature, the king was acknowledging he was not above the law, and in certain areas, subjects actually held greater authority, or at least had some level of protection under the law. Thus, the king was ultimately limited by the law, and they were laws devised by others than himself. It was reissued in 1217 and 1225, and in 1297 was officially added to the statutes of England in the confirmation of charters by King Edward I. By Edward submitting the Magna Carta to these statutes, he was once again highlighting the Crown's validation of this document, and ultimately the validation that the king was limited in certain areas of the law. So the idea that the people could challenge the king's absolute prerogative was established, and was quite revolutionary, although it did not lead to an actual revolution or overthrow of the established order. Yet, the idea the king was subject to others and the law was a revolutionary ideal, and one the English people and later British colonists would use for their political revolutions. The importance of the Magna Carta was reinforced in 17th century England with the onset of the English Civil Wars during the 1640s and the 1688 English Glorious Revolution. Parliamentarians, acting as representatives of the people, heralded the Magna Carta as the official reason a king was not above the law, but rather subject to the laws created and enforced through Parliament. In 1688, as King James II fled England and effectively abdicated his throne, Parliament gave the crown to William and Mary. In so doing, the new king and queen were required to sign the Bill of Rights, a list of laws firmly establishing that the king and queen were not above the law at all, but rather subject to Parliament's laws, i.e., the laws of the people. With this new document, it was assured England would not have an absolute monarch, but in fact would have a constitutional monarchy, which remains Britain's governing system today. In denying divine right and supremacy of the crown, it asserted that the people of England then had certain rights of their own. Among the rights listed in this important document were the denial of cruel and unusual punishments for crimes, that English Protestant citizens could raise arms against a tyrannical government, and it was unlawful for king and government to quarter troops in the homes of private citizens. In this document, we had reassertions of the Magna Carta alongside new ideas and the assertion that these rights should extend to a larger proportion of the populace, no longer only the nobles. It was this document that became the crucial basis of English and British common law after the 1688 Revolution, and as such was extended to all areas of the British Empire, including the American colonies. It was these views outlined in the English Bill of Rights which would shape many of the political issues the American colonists had with the British government. And so, as the basis for their political motivation, it should not be surprising they adapted these ideas in the American Constitution a century later. Mixed with the valued views of the Magna Carta and English Bill of Rights, the American colonists also shaped their political theory in their own 18th century Enlightenment context. Borrowing from John Locke, who wrote directly in response to the Bill of Rights of 1688, colonists adopted a social contract theory of government. The people and the government had a political contract. Government would work for the people, and in turn, the people would grant the government legislative powers. Once the government turned against the people, this contract was broken, and the people could choose a new government. Armed with their new enlightened views, the American colonists challenged their government, demanding that their rights as British citizens outlined in the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights were not being met. As King and Parliament continued to deny these basic rights to the British colonists, the colonists believed their contract with the government had been broken, leading to revolution. The new Americans had not been against the legal systems of the British government. No, rather they heralded these earlier traditions. In their view, these great traditions, both the Magna Carta and Bill of Rights, had not been upheld. That's why they revolted. Thus, when the new nation set out to establish its own constitution, they heavily relied on the traditions of 1215 and 1688. We can see this with the original 1791 ratified amendments upholding due process under the law, no cruel and unusual punishments, trial by jury of your peers, freedom to bear arms, and prohibiting the unlawful quartering of troops. But they also adapted the Magna Carta and Bill of Rights to their own use and their own Enlightenment historical context. The social contract view, for example, was clearly articulated in the original 1787 7 articles, clearly outlining the structure of checks and balances. And the First Amendment granted American citizens the right to religious freedom, something definitely not granted in England. This was a clear example then of Enlightenment views on religious freedom shining forth in this unique constitution. Thus, the 1787 and ratified 1791 constitutions were not a new revolutionary set of rights. Rather, the American Constitution was a product of hundreds of years of legal customs and challenges between people and their government. Yet, the American colonists took the Magna Carta and Bill of Rights and under influence of their own Enlightenment context, shaped their constitution to reflect what did indeed become a unique government and nation. Professor Sen.
Thank you. And what I'm going to say actually ties in very nicely with what Dr. Allen has talked about, the history and the documents that were influential in developing the ideas behind the Constitution. I want to actually talk about the writing process of the Constitution itself. It is such a great example of interdisciplinary thought and skills and it's just a great intersection of composition and policy. The contrast with some of the British Constitution is actually not written down. Our Constitution is actually written, and through the process of drafting the document, the founders actually began to find areas of conflict that needed to be resolved. And the words that they wound up deciding upon tell us a lot about the issues at the time. It tells us about their ideas, and it tells us, and it shows us really now contrasts with the present thought and the way we run things today. The wording is really important because it reflects not only things going on at the time, but things that were happening in the drafting of the document itself, which are really important. The literary style of the document is, I think most would say, pretty legalistic, because a lot of the actual delegates were lawyers. So a great majority of the delegates were lawyers, which makes it the wording very legalistic, but also gives it a solid foundation for what it would become, the supreme law of the land. The literary style of the Constitution is attributed to Governor Morris of Pennsylvania, who worked on some of the first drafts and later drafts. The document, a lot of people don't realize, was actually penned or written by a man named Jacob Shallis. He was the clerk who actually wrote it, a name that really doesn't get brought up a lot when we talk about the Constitution. It consists of about 4,543 words, and it was worked out over a process of about 100 working days. And I thought it was interesting that in their process, they first had a lot of discussions before anything was written down. We don't have a lot of record about who was actually writing everything down. They say that James Madison took very copious notes during the process, but they established something called a committee on detail, or committee of detail, that would go through and write down and come up with the wording. And subsequently, they established a committee on style. And I think these two different committees actually really highlight the writing process as we even teach it now through the subjects of, or the process of global revision versus local revision. When we talk about global revision and composition, we talk about how when you look at your first draft, the first thing you want to do when you go to make a revision is to look for those big ideas, the global ideas, the content area and the structure that you want to, make sure that you've got correct. So the committee of detail were the content people. They were going to make sure that what was discussed was reflected in the writing, and that's what they did. And I actually have a list of their names. They included John Rutledge of South Carolina, Edmund Randolph of Virginia, Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts, Allen Ellisworth of Connecticut, and James Wilson of Pennsylvania. So that was a committee on detail. We'll call those the global revisers, looking at the content and just making sure everything is in there. And afterward, through the drafting process, they came and elected this committee of style, which is more like the local revision process, where you really look through your wording, your sentence structure, and make sure that those things are as they should be, that it's worded succinctly and clearly and better. And I'll show some examples of how this actually worked with what the Committee on Style did. So I thought that was interesting that they had both of those committees, and it's something that we try to teach our students in composition now, to go through both of those processes to really make your writing solid. I thought it was also interesting that it was through an idea of revision that we actually came to have the Constitution. We first have the Articles of Confederation, and they really met to tweak these. They knew some things needed to be changed, but at first they just wanted to fix some things that were wrong with them, fix a little wording here or there. However, when James Madison and delegates from Virginia came up with a Virginia plan, which proposed a bicameral legislature, this started conversations and a dialogue that was really the catalyst for them saying, you know what, we really need something different. So it was through that idea of, we're just going to tweak, we're just going to do this here, that they really decided, you know what, we really just need to change everything. And so they did. And this is another thing in composition that we try to teach our students is it's okay that when you start writing, you realize this is not really where you wanted to end up. Scrap it and start over if you need to. And that's really what happened. And just a few examples of these revisions. And again, I said the revisions that they made really tell us the thought process of the delegates at that time and the issues of the time. The Articles of Confederation gave a lot of power to the states. And you can see this throughout the revisions. For example, even in the preamble, the original draft says, "We the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey," and so on and so forth. They named the states involved. In a subsequent draft, they say, the Committee of Style report reads, "We the people of the United States." And it really represents there that idea of moving from power in the states to a united federal government. And you can see that to me in the revision that they made there, the Committee on Style. There are a lot of things in the Constitution that really just tell you those types of interesting details about the discussions that they were having. For example, the original Article 10, Section 1 says, "The executive power of the United States shall be vested in a single person. His title shall be the President of the United States of America, and his title shall be His Excellency." And as you know, we don't refer to our president as His Excellency. The writers actually thought that sounded a little too much like you would address a royal, and did not want the connotation of a monarchy in the writing. So they said, we need to remove that word and replace it with something better. We need to not call the president His Excellency, and now the official way to address the president is Mr. President. And so that's reflected in here. So many examples I could really go on. I just want to highlight a few. In Article 9, Section 1, a nuance of difference really highlights something. It reads, "The members of the House of Representatives shall be chosen every second year by the people of the several states," again, not the United States yet, "comprehended within this union." It focuses on the individual because it says the members of the House of Representatives. In the revision done by the Committee on Style, they say the House of Representatives shall be composed of members. So the first focus in the first instance is on the individual member who represents the individual state. And in the second instance, it's on the House of Representatives, the group as a whole. And that matters. And they knew that. This Committee on Style knew that the way we word this and how we say this matters. The precision of the words we decide to use matters. Even capitalization, they changed from the original draft to the new draft. In a lot of the original draft, the word state itself was capitalized. In subsequent drafts, and then in final draft, state is often not capitalized unless it's, of course, at the beginning of a sentence, as it should be, proper grammar. You see interesting changes like the original Section 4 says, "No tax or duty shall be laid by the legislature on articles exported from any state." As you may know, if you know anything about our system, that did not stick. They instead changed it, and it actually moved to a different section and says the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay debts, and to provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imports, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. Yes, now they can do it, but they must be the same throughout the states. Not one state can't be taxed more than another. So a big change there could have made a world of difference in, how we do things today. Thanks for that. So in some instances, you just see that they've really just clarified what they mean. Um, in the original Section 5, it says no capitation tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census herein before taken. In the subsequent draft, you see that they say no capitation tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumerations herein before directed to be taken. No preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the port of one state over another, nor shall vessels bound to or from one state be obliged to enter, clear, or pay duties in another. No tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. So here, this sounds like a lot of wording and things like that, but they're just really adding more details to how our government was going to run, how our states were going to interact with each other in regards to interstate commerce and other things like that, especially shipping, interstate shipping, and how that was going to be run. And you could really go on, but what's interesting to note is just through the writing process itself, the delegates really worked out what this new government was going to look like. And I think it's just a great example of the different disciplines coming together into a document that really became so important to our country and what we base our rule of law on today. Thank you. Dr. Bird?
Thank you, Professor Sin. It is a privilege to be here on Constitution Day to talk about that venerable old document that we depend upon so much. The Constitution is tended to be seen these days as a very old, stable, even dusty document, but it actually affects our lives so directly on a daily basis. We forget that it is actually a living document, and that's not a bad thing. It's actually quite good. It was the Constitution actually came to us out of tension and conflict. As we decided to enter into a war of independence against England, we found ourselves needing some sort of government. We created a very loosely held group of states under the Articles of Confederation. It was called a League of Friendship. It had the federal government that did exist under the Articles of Confederation was very, very weak, unable to lay taxes, unable to sustain a military. It's amazing when you consider it that we actually won the war against England under that kind of governance, because it was a very, very a weak form of government. But immediately after the war, we began to see that there is a necessity, or was a necessity at that time, to have a stronger role for a central government. And that began the discussion, because we were people at that time especially that had strong allegiances to our states. We considered ourselves Georgians before we considered ourselves Americans, or Virginians before we considered ourselves Americans, etc. So it was a difficult battle, and it is a tension that still exists today. We did move from the Articles of Confederation, as has already been said, because we called a constitutional convention in Philadelphia in 1787 to tweak the Articles of Confederation to possibly give the federal government a little more power, and out of that came a complete rewrite that we today know as the Constitution. The giants that actually gathered the Hamiltons and the Madisons and the Franklins and the Masons and others actually were providentially, many people believe, put together for that purpose. That didn't end the struggle over states' rights. As a matter of fact, the struggle over states' rights will never end so long as we have a republic. And that's also a good thing. That's the tension that creates the friction, that creates the energy on which the republic runs. There were, in those discussions, was a very strong consideration, well, what if we don't like what we've come up with? how can we change it? How can the states retain a certain amount of power so that we could change things should the government become difficult or unresponsive? Article 5 was created out of a great discussion, primarily by people like Hamilton, who believed in a very, very strong government, almost a royal kind of structure, and people like George Mason, who believed that the states should retain power, the people, as he saw it, should retain power. So we created the ability to, or the framers did, the ability to amend the Constitution. It's a difficult process, and it should be difficult. There are two ways to amend the Constitution, and they are all under consideration at all time. But the first one is 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate can propose an amendment to the Constitution and send it to the states, of which 34 states have to ratify. And that is the most used fashion. As a matter of fact, it's the only fashion for amending the Constitution that's ever been used. 11,000 amendments have been proposed or introduced by Congress. 33 have made it all the way through Congress and been sent to the states, and 27 have actually been ratified. So from 11,000 to 27, you can see we don't amend the Constitution very easily. We're very deliberative about that. That creates, again, some of that tension I was talking about, because there are those that believe that the Constitution should be amended more readily, more easily. Congress having to propose an amendment was something of a concern for people like Mason. Hamilton liked it. He believed that Congress should be involved in all of these things. But Mason was able to persuade the other delegates to enter a second means to amend the Constitution. It's called a Convention of the States. By the same basic formula, except that Congress is not involved, 2/3 of the states have to propose to amend or call a constitutional convention for the purpose of amending the Constitution. And then, with Congress not being involved except to say yes, the Constitution would be held. We've never done that. There have been over 400 calls by individual states for a constitutional convention. We've never held one. Several things happen when you begin to talk about actually calling a constitutional convention. The states, it's easy for an individual state to call, to petition Congress and say we need a constitutional convention. But then when you start getting close to the number, 34, we've actually had 33 states at one time to actually petition. Congress generally then will act and do whatever it is the states wanted in the first place to keep from the states from, quote, rebelling, if you will, and calling the Constitution. But many times it's just an individual state, or maybe 2 or 3 states, a few states, that actually call for the convention. And some of the problems that occur when you begin to get serious about it are that what are you going to amend? And then we begin to hearken back to the Articles of Confederation being tweaked and then suddenly being thrown out and rewritten. And people begin to wonder, do we have the Franklins and the Madisons and the Hamiltons to step up today? What will this Constitutional Convention actually do? The argument then becomes, well, why can't Congress limit what the convention would consider? Well, 2 problems with that. One is that Congress really isn't involved in limiting, because Congress was designed to be out of this for the most part. And the other thing is, when you begin to limit it, what do you include and what do you leave out? There's a long list of issues that many people, many states would like to see a constitutional convention entertain, limiting the terms of members of Congress, balancing the budget, and on and on and on. But then you begin to look at it, well, maybe should we require a balanced budget? What about in a time of war? Should we limit the terms of Congress? Why don't we just vote the people out that we don't like? Why should we not allow someone to serve who's doing a good job? And on and on. When you begin to get down to the nitty gritty, it's a lot like your mother used to tell you when you were playing with your friends, and she would say, you know, it's all fun and games until somebody loses an eye. Well, here you go, Patch. One of these guys is going to lose something when it comes time to limit it. So every time we get close, out of the 400 times, every time we get close or get serious about it, people, the public, the states, tend to withdraw. We're in one of those phases again where the Constitutional Convention idea is on the rise. There are national organizations that are promoting it now. And it's a different world. It's a different way of handling public policy. It will require a lot of money to promote a constitutional convention. There are people with lots of money who are willing to spend it for that purpose. It will require a lot of outreach. Well, we have numerous 24/7 cable news cycles, and they would be just delighted to have a story about a contentious constitutional convention being proposed. Even with that, Georgia being one of them, there are only 4 states, I believe, that have called for the convention at this time. And whether or not that will happen remains to be seen. There's an old saying in public administration that where you stand tends to depend upon where you sit. We will see if there is sufficient interest in a convention. I find myself being skeptical of, one, of the need, and two, of the strength of the people to actually do this sort of thing. I'm not saying I'm afraid of it, but I do believe that it was made especially difficult. This method especially was made especially difficult for a reason. It's supposed to be a very, very high hill to climb. We've set the bar quite high. It remains to be seen if we will be able to reach it. And the other thing, is it necessary? I do believe, though, even in the day when we speak in apocalyptic terms of government and how bad it is, and this may be our last chance to reclaim the United States, et cetera, and that idea is promoted incessantly by certain factions and certain agencies even. I am less inclined to believe that than I am to believe in the wisdom and even the divine providence that brought us the Constitution in the first place. I believe it's the venerable document that has lasted over 200 years, and given just the right amount of maintenance and attention by us, the people, it will last another 200. Thank you.